Anthony Darby.
Chuck Hen.
We are back with Mike Cardozo. Mike, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me back, guys. And congratulations on the new facility.
I really appreciate it. I think we maybe have had Nurse Laura back a second time, but haven't had a lot of chances to have repeat guests. And in Mike's world and in our world, a year's time or a year and a half time is is monumental. Our industry moves so fast. Things that were 80% sure in January are 90% done by November, and just a lot of fluctuation, a lot of things that come by. So, just in case anybody doesn't remember from our first podcast, Mike was one of the first relationships that I made in the state of Maryland. I was hounding him on his cell phone through text and phone calls several times a week, making sure that when he picked his top few dispensaries that were going to get product, that I made that short list, and for that I'm forever grateful. I really am. And now, just to further the narrative, that relationship was with you and I, and then the relationship then kind of became with GTI. And Manny is a good friend of both of ours, and he has done just a phenomenal job of facilitating that relationship to now GTI actually has floor space in our dispensary.
Right.
They have a wall. We dedicated. They're one of our top partners. So it's amazing that relationship is still carried on beyond. Even honestly, the relationship is kind of Cody and Manny now at this point, right? We kind of planted the seed, but it's still there. So thank you for coming back.
I spent the day with Manny just last week.
Really?
Keeping close touch, yeah.
He came down to, he was one of our first pop-ups when we opened up, and I just really appreciate his story of being a server in a golf club restaurant, waiting on you to taking a chance, and then the rest is his story of him working hard and him busting his ass and getting up there. It's a cool story to tell, and now he's got a kid and stuff. It's just like, it's cool.
It's great to see. He's very passionate, hardworking, and he deserves all the success.
So what I want to talk today about, twofold. One is you're a wealth of knowledge of programs outside of the state of Maryland and even at international level, which just at a fairly fine-tooth comb we'll touch on. And to be honest, I would say, not to speak for Chuck, but we're nowhere near as involved at the national level as we were even just a year and a half, 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I could tell you when Missouri's application was coming out, what was going on with it, and I'd signed up, and I was,
You got our hands full with this one here in Salisbury.
Truthfully, the narrative of businesses die of indigestion, not starvation, is something that is constantly on the forefront of a cannabis owner, because there's so many opportunities, and a lot of it is picking and choosing the right opportunities, not accepting all the opportunities, and because I think that just burn out, just becomes too much. So now that you are kind of past that, you're basically outside of working in the day-to-day of the Maryland industry, you've taken more of a position as an advocate, right?
Yeah, advocate, just overall industry entrepreneur. Advocate is always going to be at the forefront of my identity within the industry, just by nature, because I believe so strongly in certain issues related to the cannabis industry. But
tell your why story real quick. I mean, in case they forgot. I mean, it's compelling.
I had a medical background. I since high school volunteered as an EMT and paramedic eventually, and I witnessed the opioid epidemic and the impact it was having on my friends and just people around me, both from being a college student and volunteering on an ambulance. And when I learned that medical marijuana had a huge impact on it, I realized this was going to be the game changer in our generation for opioids. And sure enough, here we are today, and every state, I think without exception, that has medical marijuana has seen a 25% reduction in opioid-related deaths.
Maryland included.
Yeah, so the numbers speak for themselves. It's saving a lot of lives, and that's really what drives me. I want people to have a safe alternative to opioids, and I want patients to have access to safe medicine.
And that access thing is something that that I believe is really the most important thing in my mind facing the cannabis industry right now. And And it's some. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to add one other thing, and it relates to access. The other sort of newfound passion that I've discovered in the last year or two are these social justice issues. To tell you the truth, I didn't really know what social justice meant a few years ago, and now I've come to understand it, become passionate about it, and really want to do something about it as I've learned about more and more markets, particularly Illinois. And I've come to understand the issues that are preventing diversity in the industry and the reasons why it's so critical that we provide opportunities to the communities that were hit the hardest by the war on drugs. And that social equity and social justice has been something that I've enjoyed learning more about, getting more involved in, and that I intend to continue to work on.
So let's put the access piece to the back burner. Let's just dive into that piece of it a little bit, because quite honestly, that's something that I didn't focus on a lot at all, or really necessarily prioritize in terms of areas that I was really trying to make a difference in. But as I was faced with more and more information and fact-based evidence of how the war on drugs adversely affected certain populations of folks, and how folks with darker colored skin were vastly affected differently than what I saw a lot of my white friends happen to. And then you start looking at the dynamics within those communities in terms of what's happening there characteristically that make these scenarios, the war on drugs, even more complicated. We had Mitchell Jermichael on here as a community advocate. We kind of dove into some of those dynamics of what happens, the difference of 17-year-old kid who has a strong family background gets arrested for pot versus a 17-year-old kid whose parents aren't going to make sure he makes his court date, right, and may not help him out and may not be there. And then the piece of it gets into what can we do through the hiring and through the, of creating opportunities. And I serve as now co-chair on the MDMDA, which is still, in my mind, an odd name for Dispensary Association, but that's our Maryland Dispensary Association.
It's a hard one to say sometimes.
And it sounds like a different drug.
Yeah.
They have a DREAM initiative, right? And this is around diversity and recruitment, and education, and building a platform through our Maryland dispensaries that makes it so that these folks of communities that have been underserved have a way of advancing through the cannabis industry in a faster track way, so that it's trying to create a more level playing field. But then also, more importantly, it's going in these communities that, to your point, have been mostly affected, and saying, look, if this is a rising tide, then you guys should be rising as well. This shouldn't just be affecting these folks and making their lives better. Like, this should be across the board. And when I looked at what I think, when we get into the social justice issues, and just being completely honest, I think there's a lot of people that talk a lot of talk. They get on social media, they slam on their keyboard, share articles, but then what do you do, right? Like, what are you actually doing?
Right.
And for me, like, that was the next question, and something that I felt I was passionate about was the employment aspect of it, right? So I don't know if you know Dexter from Marion, Maine.
Yeah.
So him and I are co-chairing together this committee, and we're not just, we're working with the community college, we're also working with HBCUs, but then we're also creating a program where new high school graduates can come in and ideally do a 2 to 3 week work internship and make that decision quickly, because we know very often that a college education is not required to get into a processing lab or to get into cultivation, right? But we know those jobs aren't super high paying, right, and we know that experience is rewarded. So the earlier we can get those folks into making those decisions, get them industry minded and get them career track oriented into the cannabis industry and provide them opportunities, we believe that that's a great way to fast track those folks. So by the time they're 23, 24, they're in management positions. By the time they're 25, 26, they're running the dispensaries. They're not just coming in as a dispensary agent.
Exactly. And you bring up a good point there with the employment aspect, and what do you actually do other than talk about the issue. You and I and Chuck, we're the face of the industry. It's dominated by majority white males with access to liquid capital that they can put at risk. The very nature of the industry, as a result of the federal law, and the restrictions on bank loans and financial assistance puts the communities that are the most disadvantaged and hit the hardest from the war on drugs at the highest barrier to entry. These individuals have the least access to capital. It's if you step back, it becomes normal to us because we live in this world. But the idea of putting down a huge sum of capital just to apply to a state with 1,000 other applicants, for 75 spots is, the odds are unbelievable. And people put everything they have into applications, and it's not fair. And the result is an ownership pool that is mostly white male. Now, I got an up-close and personal lesson in this in Illinois because they were the first state to legislate a social equity program into their cannabis legislation. Really historic, really, really great, exciting move. Essentially what they did is they said, okay, applicants, if you can qualify as a social equity applicant and receive an additional 20% on your application, one of two ways. You can either have 51% or more of your company owned by an Illinois resident living in a disadvantaged region or with a cannabis conviction on their record, or for the next 6 months, pre-license, you can employ in an incubator type format 10 individuals, pay them at a rate of 35 hours per week, and essentially train them to get into the industry whether you win a license or not. Those individuals had to reside in those disadvantaged communities or have convictions. We thought long and hard about this. We really wanted to apply in Illinois because we believed so strongly in the social justice issue. It was also a pretty big financial commitment to do this pre-license. But I decided that if we did it right, it would really make an impact whether we won or not. So I sort of went to the extreme of taking action, and I got on the ground in Illinois. I partnered up with Cabrini Green Legal Aid, a really cool legal group that helps incarcerated folks learn about their employment rights when they get out of prison, and the Illinois Bureau of Prisons. And I worked with an African American church, and together I got face to face with the people coming out of prison who this program was aimed at. I didn't try to find a way around it or an easy way to check the box. I went straight to the heart of the problem and looked the people in the eye and explained the program and handpicked a group of really deserving individuals who really wanted to be in the industry and wouldn't have the chance. And what I said to them is, we're going to give you training, you're going to take online classes, but I said, I'm going to come out here myself every month and I'm going to teach you, and I'm also going to mentor all of you individually, and I will do that whether we win a license, in which case you'll have a job with us, or if we don't, I will help you get a job and I will stick with you. And it was a very rewarding experience. And again, the licenses aren't finalized yet, but even if we lose, I know it's made an impact, and it was just a great thing to be involved in Illinois. And then the last point about hiring, I was at a dinner in Chicago, and there was an African American guy there who we were talking about how I can make a difference, how Mike and my plant touching operations can make a difference. And like you said, my first thought was, well, I can make a conscious choice to hire a diverse pool of employees. And, that's how hard can that be? That's just something that it's the right thing to do. And it is important, and I do that. But this gentleman really made me think. He said, until they're in your chair, the needle hasn't really moved. And what he was saying is that what we need is diversity in ownership. We need equity holding, groups of minority individuals, just like you and I, so that, let's take Manny, for example. So, you hire, you mentor, you foster the development and growth of an individual, and eventually they bring enough value to an application team. Suddenly they're offered 5% equity. Next thing you know, they're a partial owner of a cannabis operation. That's my ultimate goal, is start with the hiring, but eventually change the landscape of the ownership pool of the industry and make it more diverse.
And I think that's where we go. And to your point, table stakes is hiring employees that reflect your patient population or reflect diversity, right? But the next step is really mentoring and giving them a platform to grow so that they can, in most cases, leave you and go on their own, right?
Right.
And go be you, right? Like that's
and sticking with them and
it's kind of
following
that's
through.
What you did with an apprenticeship, right?
Right.
You work for a plumbing company, you learn how to be a plumber, and
Right.
then if you thought you were good enough, the plumber shook your hand, and you got your own truck and became your own plumber. It wasn't
Exactly.
the idea that you were going to go and work for somebody else for the rest of your life.
Right.
And like that's the entrepreneurship piece that I so strongly believe in. And the other piece is that, and I don't know how Illinois is, but I can tell you that in Maryland, sometimes they do more harm than good in how they legislate these things when they try to legislate diversity.
Yes.
And a lot of times there's handcuffs on minority applicants, especially when it comes to the capital piece of it.
Yes.
I know and had a very intimate conversation with a minority applicant who told me one of his biggest challenges was finding minority money because he had, quite honestly, white folks that wanted to invest in him as an equal partner, as an equity interest, not at this this level of hierarchy, but that would push him over the 51% threshold. That would require a management group, and so sometimes there are these consequences, and I guess it resonated in me because when he talked about the lack of traditional capital access. This is what we're talking about, is you have to have a rich white guy. You have to have a money guy to be able to do anything. And we weren't money guys, right? So we are complete outliers in our organization in the fact that we submitted our application for $5,500. We showed the receipts. We didn't spend more than $192,000.
That's the thing, is that you were able to do that. Illinois, I think, has come the closest to getting the diversity piece right. They didn't quite get it right because by requiring the applicant to pay 6 months of payroll to 10 individuals in addition to the licensing fees pre-license during the application phase, you're talking about $100 to $200,000 of expenses pre-license in a 1,600 applicant pool for 75 licenses. And if they had just done that, switched it to where requirement was post-license, once you've secured the first approval and then have that security, then it makes perfect sense. But what they ended up doing is drawing in huge numbers of minority applicants and incentivizing them to put their life savings on the line and resulting in a huge problem because they didn't quite get the diversity where they wanted it. There were issues on the application scoring, but by creating an extremely high capital requirement on the front end, they accidentally kept minorities out.
And not just minorities, right? They just kept the average Joe out.
Right, and so what you end up seeing, to your point, are these agreements where people are just looking for someone to fill that role. And I didn't want to do that, but nobody has gotten it right yet. I think the key to it is significant funds that are available and allocated to these companies. What really needs to happen is the industry needs to get to a point where there's an association that represents this issue for all the states, because what we're seeing are massive differences in the regulations and the way this is being addressed. And right now it's all up to the individual owners. And there really needs to be some consistency with this because it's a really important issue.
And sorry,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, is that something that probably can't necessarily be fixed until it's somewhat legalized at the federal level? Because at least there's that oversight there, and you have access to some other capital aside from like just,
exactly.
rich people with money.
All the things we're talking about here, access to liquid capital, things like that, it all falls back to federal legalization. DEA, descheduling, that stuff needs to happen first. And the trickle-down effect will be all these things will change. It'll be eventually no different than going to a bank and getting a small business or a minority business loan, which is how it should be.
Yeah, it's such a challenge. One of the challenges I find with our industry, and it seems to be in my mind our Achilles heel, is that we can't rally around as an industry to get a couple things accomplished. It seems like there's so many sub-interests within our industry, whether it's social justice as being the number one issue, whether it's patient access being the number one issue at a federal level.
Right.
You don't always come on lobby day together. Like Big Pharma fights 364 days a year, but on lobby day...
And I think that's a result of our compartmentalization that has happened because this is a state-by-state, not a national industry, and it's dramatically different across state borders, and there's no effective communication channel between the states, which is something that I would really like to see happen is, get the regulators in communication with each other so that they can really start to learn from each other and finally start to get this right, because we continue to see states do some things right and make some huge mistakes every time.
Yeah, we talked about some of the key factors that really dictate the characteristics of a program, and honestly, and I'd like to get your feedback on this, but I feel like Maryland's one of the best programs in the country for patients. It seems like you have access to flower. You seem like the qualifying conditions seem to be pretty good. Everything seems to kind of roll in line and make a lot of sense. But to be in a state where, like Delaware, for instance, a Delaware patient who lives 15 miles from us literally has nowhere near the same quality of healthcare access from a cannabis perspective than our patients do.
Yeah, it's night and day.
It's all vertically integrated, which is the first piece of it, right? And to understand the challenge that makes, we downstairs at this point now carry flower from roughly, I would say 12 to 13 growers, cultivars. There's probably like 2 or 3 that we don't. And then roughly 17 to 18 processors. There's probably 2 or 3 processors we don't.
Right.
Roughly 40 different vendors that we count on to supply our inventory. And because of that, we have a wide diversity of products because each vendor kind of finds their own niche or has their own thing, and it provides a lot of value to our patients. In Delaware, you can only sell what you made yourself.
Right. It's a restricted market.
It's a restricted market, and it really is impossible for that model in that lack of scale to be able to keep up with the flower, keep up with the processed products, and be able to deliver what's needed.
Right. So the way I look at a market when I'm deciding whether to pursue it or not, there's certain things that I look at every time that are really the most important factors about whether I think it's going to be competitive or not. I start off by looking at the big picture. What is the law? What is the program aimed at doing? Is it medical? Is it adult use? How many licenses are they planning to award? What's the state population? Are they awarding the same number of licenses in retail processing wholesale? Is vertical integration required? Are they requiring that real estate be locked down before the application? And then I start to get, a little bit more into the nuanced details of the regulations, such as what are the qualifying conditions? Have they included the all-important catch-all, meaning a certifying provider can recommend cannabis for any condition that they deem necessary? That little clause in regulations is one of the most dramatic indicators of market success. Who are the certifying providers? Are they just going to be physicians? Because we know that physicians tend to have concerns about liability and legality. Or are they going to allow nurses, physical therapists to recommend? Are there product restrictions, such as no edibles allowed to be sold? Are there cannabinoid restrictions, like the low THC markets where you can only sell products below 0.3%, basically removing the medical value? And then I look at the political landscape of the state. Is it likely to get, and when I say that, I mean the municipal landscape. Where is this supported? Where's the opposition? Are there residency requirements like 51%? Is the application going to really be merit-based? Can I differentiate from the next guy in a merit-based form on the application, or is it just
already pre-decided and this is kind of pomp and circumstance?
Exactly. And again, what's the upfront capital cost? And those things are critical. It's sort of an algorithm that you look at. I'll give you an example. I recently, and Maryland is sort of the perfect state to use as a comparison point here. Maryland did set up a really solid industry as far as competition. The benchmark that you want to see in medical markets with patient growth is 1% of the population per year. In Maryland, 6 million people in the state, that's roughly 60,000 patients per year. Here we are, less than 3 years into the market, we have 115,000 registered patients. It's working in Maryland because they went out of their way to set up a streamlined, efficient process for people to register. They didn't make it intentionally more difficult by requiring fingerprints and background checks. They included the catch-all, all of these critical things. They allowed people to go to any dispensary that they wanted to. Then take Illinois, which started their medical program in 2015. For 5 years, until January 1st of this year, they had, over the course of 5 years, less than 50,000 patients registered because the process was so cumbersome. Criminal background check, fingerprints, you're assigned to one dispensary. Yes. And so to register as a patient. And you were,
by
you
the
had
way,
to
a
go
lot of our
same shop.
patients already have anxiety and are concerned about publicly coming out and getting their card because they may have had a criminal issue in the back, right? Like, so
Right.
like, I can't imagine like how that, just those two pieces alone, just to put it into context, our patients are so concerned about who may know that they're on a list or who may know that they have a card to deliver up fingerprints and a background check. I mean,
Again, coming back to the theme of access, the approach has to focus on patient access above all else. And I think Maryland did that, and it shows. We're seeing there's 15 or 16 states out there with restricted markets, and they're stagnant. I think it's really a result of the state wanting to get their feet wet in the industry and see if anything goes terribly wrong. But in reality, there's no tangible benefit to the citizens in the state. You take Georgia, Virginia, these are states that have CBD oil only sales allowed, or a state like Alabama, which is low THC, below 0.3%.
Virginia has some progress towards a medical program, right?
It's still it's low THC and CBD oil only. So there's legislative progress being made, but no, it's still extremely restrictive.
And they
New
didn't
York,
get around
no
the
flowers.
THCA thing or any of that, right?
I don't believe so.
Gotcha.
And then New York with no flower sales. These are very damaging things, and they're things from the entrepreneur angle that will stop me from going after a market.
Well, I think at the end of the day, you have to realize there's already a market in every state. It's a black market, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's cannabis around in almost every state where you go, in almost every town you can find it. And one of the things that I knew that I was always kind of looking at was, if we don't make this easier for patients to come to us than the street, if there's no perceived value in making that transition, then you're not going to get that. And I think of places like New York is a great example. Where you don't have flower, then you're missing out on a huge piece of your market. You have patients that would love to participate legally, that want to buy into what the state is trying to offer, but the state made it cumbersome and didn't address their needs.
You got to give people a reason, an incentive to get up, come into a store, and buy it in a regulated market. That reason might be the quality. That reason might be the price. Maybe they like the person they deal with at the dispensary. You have to use the black market as a comparison point when you're in the legal side of this industry, and you have to balance it, because you go too low and you end up promoting diversion. People come in and buy their entire limit and go sell it on the street. You go too high and nobody registers.
Yep.
So it's a constant balancing act. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any states in particular that will be making some substantial changes from going from no program to maybe having a program that you think in the next few
Yeah, there's this November there's actually 5 states with legislation referendums on the ballot. There's Arizona with an adult use referendum. It's got a lot of support. It almost passed in 2016. It's a very lucrative market out there. It's very likely to pass, and that'll be a really strong adult use market. You've got a lot of big operators out there.
Their medical program is pretty similar to ours, right?
Yes.
I believe that we used that as one of our benchmarks when we were
trying to figure it out 3 or 4 years ago, trying to look at other states and industries. I mean, they're not exactly similar, but it was something we looked at as like a participation.
Around a 1%, 1.2% participation rate out there.
Yes.
This was 3 years ago.
And big vertically integrated operators. Then you've got Mississippi, which is working on its first medical program. It's kind of on the fence. There's quite a bit of legislative opposition. It's a pretty conservative state.
There's a pretty strong gaming lobby in Mississippi, right?
Yes, there is.
Are they endorsing or not? Do you know?
That's actually one of the issues that is potentially going to slow this down, is related to the gaming lobby out there.
Follow the dollars, man. You just got Papa Darby, get on a riverboat tour in Mississippi and call it a day.
Basically, they're putting pressure on the legislature to make the process to pass the bill more cumbersome. So they may not pass this year. Then Montana is looking at going from medical to adult use.
Chuck.
New Jersey is going to be really interesting. They are primed to explode, and there's a lot of support. I think it's going to pass, and I think it's going to be a very lucrative market, especially with their neighbor, New York, next door, where people are allowed to come in, buy the product, take it back, and there's no flower sales in New York. Governor Murphy in New Jersey is a huge advocate. Last time around, I filled out an entire application, and then at the last minute, when they cut the number of licenses down, I decided to hold back. But I'll be throwing my hat in the ring again in New Jersey. And then finally, my favorite, South Dakota, coming in hot. The first state,
medical use.
First state to have both medical and adult use on the ballot at the same time.
Got it.
Does it have support on the recreational end of it out there?
It's mixed, but there is quite a bit of support on the medical side.
Yeah, the medical side, I'm looking right now, it looks like a decent program. 3 ounces. Prescribed by a physician. Oh, there's a home cultivation piece of that. Interesting.
Yep.
Is that the first state that's come in hot with both
it's the first.
at the same time?
It's the first simultaneous ballot. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of Indian reservations there too. They know the benefits. Yeah.
That's awesome. Have we seen any? There hasn't been any market to ever launch a market and then rescind, right? Like no one said, we're going to launch a medical program, and then they came back and said this was a failure, we're going to crush it.
I don't think they've crushed it. I think they've reviewed processes and made adjustments, much like in Maryland with the diversity and the license numbers. But I don't think anyone has ever completely reset. Not that I've heard.
No, it seems like there's a couple of programs that just kind of like Delaware just kind of just puts along. There doesn't seem to be a huge growth trajectory there, like in Maryland. But to the best of my knowledge, there's never been a state that said, okay, we should allow access to medical cannabis, and then said, oh my gosh, this is a horrible idea. Let's not do this.
Right. One of the things I think is interesting, that is another huge factor when I'm looking at a market, is the saturation risk. If they're talking about 300 licenses to supply a state like Maryland with 6 million people, then I'm immediately seeing red flags of market saturation and price drops, consolidation, companies going out.
Multi-state operators having a huge advantage against individual operators.
Exactly. I call it just failure to thrive. The industry will fail to thrive. You've got to keep the market competitive. You have to balance that very, very carefully. And in Missouri, this was an interesting case. I couldn't quite figure out why Missouri was going to award so many dispensary licenses. Almost 200 or something, 196 or something like that. 80 some processing. And I tried to get into the head of the regulators, and I finally found this market study from one of the state universities, and their assessment was that their patient population growth was going to grow roughly 2,500 people per year for the first couple of years, and then 5,000 per year. They said eventually reaching about 50,000 by 2024. They have the same population that we do, 6 million people, and they're putting out almost 200 dispensaries.
Twice as many as we have in every aspect.
Exactly. It just as soon as I saw that, I stepped back because it's going to be a problem. I think.
Yeah, and honestly, speaking of the timing of the market and everything, I have some concerns about the minority applicants that just got licenses in Maryland.
Coming in late, you mean?
Yeah, it's a tougher road for them to toe. I mean, it truly is.
We knew that from the start. Obviously, I'm a big believer in being first to market. I think it's comes above all else.
We shared that.
And I really empathize for them coming in late. But baby steps. At least they're coming into the market, into the industry, and they're here. And I think they'll get there, especially in a state like Maryland.
I think I'm still opportunistic in terms of the growth for Maryland. I can tell you that we're adding more patients now at a rate than we were a year ago. I think this pandemic has put a lot of people in a stressful situation, and they're looking at different ways of medicating. And we went all in on this campus model during a pandemic, and the dispensary is one thing, but everything else on this side of the house is not as sexy and savory as trying to get someone to do breathing exercises and take a yoga class and try CBD and try these non-intoxicating forms of wellness. But I knew that how the general vibe of we're in a kind of a fucked up place in the world right now, man. And a place like this is really needed, and people, I think, are more and more open to looking at ways to feel better than maybe they were 6 months ago.
The pandemic, I think, is going to have some interesting effects down the road.
Some state power.
There's the obvious ones on consumer behavior. We're not seeing our regulars coming into the shop every week like we were a year ago, and spending average transaction $100, $120, something in that range per transaction. Maybe that patient comes in 4 or 5 times a month. Now we're seeing that patient come in once or twice a month and spending $300+. So far fewer transactions, but higher transaction amounts. And I think the demand, though, is going to continue to rise for the reasons that you said. But there's also going to be some unique impacts on the retail side. Obviously, the drive-through model, curbside delivery is becoming much more relevant.
I think it's going to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere.
I do too. And I also think, though, that there's going to be a lot of real estate opportunities coming about in the industry with the impact on retail. And I think that it's going to cause states and legislatures to view cannabis and its potential revenue as a possible rescue economic stimulus, much like they view gaming opportunities, like is happening in Maryland right now with gaming. Cannabis is a perfect comparison for that. You can generate $100 million in revenue with it.
So I got really intimately involved in a lot of the education talks on the Eastern Shore as the Kerwin plan, which was Maryland's education plan, came with basically $100 million price tag, and someone stood up and was like, well, if you're missing $100 million and cannabis can bring $100 million, maybe we should put these two together, right? And the actual narrative from a political standpoint is they go out to Colorado and go to a Denver baseball game where everyone's smoking weed and like, oh my gosh, we can't do this in Maryland. And it kind of gets squashed, right?
Yeah.
Now, not from a long-term perspective, because now that we're in a pandemic and
Hopefully
the
they'll think
budgets are
differently.
tighter, I believe that there's probably a better appetite now than ever before to do an adult use program. I want to pick your brain, though, about that question. I kind of think that even if they were to say in this year's legislature that they want to pass it, you're not seeing it until 2022, probably from an adult use perspective. Now, do you think...
I agree. I mean, and that's assuming it's a Biden administration, and that's assuming the Democrats regain control of the Senate. I don't think anything is going to move until Democrats regain the Senate. There has to be total control of the House,
I just been at the
Senate,
state of Maryland
and-
level. I mean, at the state level.
On this coming, no, because I think that the working group has pretty much been stagnant and isn't ready to put up a bill. I don't think it's coming yet, but I do think next couple of years.
Do you think federal will act before state, and for Maryland in particular? Do you think they'll see a federal legalization before Maryland, or do you think Maryland will beat federal?
I think Maryland will beat federal, but I think they're sort of on an equal scale of priority. You know, right now it's hard for federal, state, or municipal government to prioritize cannabis. And when they're out of the crisis mode, I think that's when things will start to shift. But as the federal opens, there will be a trickle-down effect, and the state legalization will just explode, especially when interstate commerce opens. So hopefully that happens with a Democratic administration. I think it could just be a couple years.
So here's a question. I don't know if you know the answer to it. Since Illinois has a medical market, and they've had a medical market, maybe not the best structured medical market, but now they're introducing a recreational market. What effect does a rec market have on the existing medical markets, I guess?
So oftentimes the existing medical operators, because of the initial higher risk that they've taken and their on the ground operating time, they will be grandfathered or given 1 year to sort of own the territory of the state prior to the new licenses coming in. That's common. I think it's often fair. So those medical operators will have a significant leg up and brand equity, things like that, when the adult use laws open up. Unfortunately, though, one of the negatives is I think that a lot of companies lose sight of the importance of medical. Aside from the tax rates, adult use is sort of a different ballgame altogether. You're talking about a massive difference in sales, product diversity, all kinds of things like this, but it doesn't change the fact that medical cannabis needs to exist. So I think a lot of companies just sort of start to ignore it and let it fade away. But I think and I hope that there's people like me and us out there who, of course I'm going to go after adult use markets, but I'm always going to have a serious medical operation right there.
This is me. So I've been very clear about my stance, and the whole thing that we've done, I don't allow myself to just assume I'm grandfathered in for a rec license, right? I have a medical focus. We have a medical campus. We thought that this was our way to insulate ourselves to weather any storm. Because if we have a strong medical program and we keep that and we actually build a patient base and we serve patients, whether rec is there or not, I think we can exist and thrive. And it bothers me in some ways, the licensees that have already skipped to running their medical dispensary like a rec dispensary.
I agree. And you and I know the operations of dispensaries in and out. It is not that difficult to maintain the medical side of the operation while you go into an adult use type of structure. It's just not that difficult compared to all of the other operational factors that you have to deal with every day. To keep a section of your store operating as medical, make sure that you stock medical products, that you have knowledgeable staff. Compared to what we deal with every day, it's easy, but it's a choice. Like everything else, it comes down at the end of the day, it's a choice of the owner or the entrepreneur.
Yeah,
how to do
it's
it.
a reflection. I mean, you can very much tell when you walk into a dispensary what the owners value, right?
Exactly, like we were talking about.
We were talking about there's dispensaries in Maryland you walk into and it looks like Las Vegas. It doesn't look like medical. And then you go to a place, I hope you feel like ours, where it looks like a clean medical facility, and we don't have the cool signage, and we may not have some of the frills and thrills, but that's not, in my mind, important for a medical dispensary. Like, everything that we've done is always tried to be through the context of being validated like a specialty medicine. I want to be looked at
patients
like
first.
And I want to be looked at like the cancer treatment center. I want to be looked at like the neurologist. I want to be looked at as we operate in cannabinoid-based medicine, and we're as equal partner of value in your total health care as any other specialty provider. And
last week I did a virtual seminar for the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy about legislative advocacy and different topics about the industry. And one of the things I told them is we have a credibility problem and a legitimacy problem. And you all are going to help us fix that by having this degree from a reputable scientific institution. You are by default going to make the industry more credible. We need you to interface with the population and help legitimize and normalize cannabis. The way to deal with the stigma is to normalize, and it's to standardize and make things more credible. And the medical side has to remain, and it has to stay a priority no matter what.
And we've beat this dead horse a million times, but because each state's program is so different, it's tough to have that standardization. It's tough to be able to provide education for physicians at a national level when it's impossible because every state is different. When you're speaking to physicians in Maryland, what their ability to do is completely different than a physician in Virginia.
Right.
Even though they may live 15 miles from each other, right? And they're serving diverse patients that may be coming from out of state. Like
the onus is going to be on us, the pioneers, for a while until full federal legalization. It's going to be on us to do the right thing. And I have confidence that this industry has enough people in it that think like we do and that have seen the life-changing impact medical marijuana has on people, that strong medical programs will remain. Of course, companies will make their own choices, but I know what you and I will be doing. And I believe in adult use as much as the next guy from the business side, but I'm not going to give up medical.
For me, my push towards adult use, like, it's kind of weird. Like, I varied. Like, obviously, in my younger years, I thought it was the only way to go, right? And then when I got into the medical side, I was like, there might be some value in building up our credibility. There might be some value in keeping it medical so that we can kind of convince the physicians and the folks that this has medicinal value. And that's actually more important than just widespread access to everyone. And then, but then,
I see that.
But then my evolution came, and then you start looking at the criminal justice program. And my final thought was, no, until this is decriminalized, until this is no longer federally illegal and people can get arrested for having a plant in their pocket, we're not going to, like, you can't get to the other issues. It has to stop there. It has to, you have to stop being able to arrest somebody for having a plant. Like, it's
exactly. That was one of the things that when I was thinking about this podcast was we've heard a lot of talk lately, especially since the vice presidential debate, about decriminalization. And I was just thinking about the difference between legalization and decriminalization. You know, legalization is, going from a bill proposed to the legislature to being written into law. And it allows a state to tax and regulate the sale and consumption of cannabis. It also allows them to generate a lot of revenue from those taxes. Decriminalization is a state choosing to make cannabis possession, for example, a civil offense instead of a criminal offense. That makes a dramatic impact on criminal justice reform. There is no reason every single state in the U.S. should not decriminalize cannabis immediately. Maybe it's going to take you a few years to wrap your head around legalization, but if you haven't decriminalized yet, then you're in the wrong century. It's a no-brainer. And I think, Illinois not only decriminalized, they're expunging 800,000 criminal records.
Which is the next step, too. Like, that's a big piece of it as well. And, like, even the decriminalization piece, what I've been educated on is that fine affects people in the lower socioeconomic status a lot more than it does anyone else. So maybe it is only $100 fine, but they didn't pay the fine because they didn't have $100, or they didn't think about it, or whatever the case may be. Like, I feel like until you get the state's attorney's office, until you get prosecutors out of the cannabis world, and some drugs in general, like the war on drugs and just criminal prosecuting on drugs doesn't seem to be going so well for the United States of America. I just, for me, I've wearied back and forth, but I just, I'm really pushing towards that legalization. I just think it needs to happen.
I mean, the war on drugs failed completely, and this is a huge opportunity for retribution and for us to start turning things around. But you're exactly right. It has to be done in a coordinated effort, and the first domino that has to fall is removing it from the DEA's list of scheduled drugs, not moving it down to Schedule 2, taking it off the list. You were asking about the international markets. The countries that are doing well are the ones that have removed the regulatory hurdles. The first thing that they did was take away the barriers and create a streamlined process. And none of that can happen until the DEA changes that policy.
Is there anything else you want to dive into today?
I promised you a quick international update.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, personal favorite. Thailand just passed, first Asian country to pass medical legislation a few months ago.
That's pretty cool.
It is cool. I mean, Asian countries did not view favorably on marijuana laws. So they've passed it, they've legislated it, now they got to roll out the program. In the EU, Germany is the dominant player. Germany's representing 75% of sales in the EU.
For medical, I guess.
For medical. By 2024, they expect to have 1 million registered medical patients. They're the second largest importer of cannabis in the world, mostly from Canada and the Netherlands. So Germany's really keeping the EU afloat. They also are anticipating. Let me rewind a little bit. They were importing so much from Canada and the Netherlands that they were becoming over-reliant. So they just issued a huge batch of domestic licenses within Germany to become less reliant. But that also goes to show you the import-export opportunity, which is really what I'm after. Then you've got...
is Canada and Netherlands, are they the two largest exporters of cannabis in the world?
Yes.
And
then Israel and Germany are importing a lot of it. On the export side, you're seeing in South America, Uruguay, which is the first country in the world to fully legalize, Colombia, again, setting up solid regulatory schemes to allow for export. Israel, for sure, is going to be a big, they're, at the top of the game for research and medical cannabis product development. And let's see, who else? I think those are the big ones right now.
I appreciate that. The last
So
thing
I'll see you
I'll
in
say,
Thailand.
so yeah, we actually had one of the, he had Cam on, who's one of the growers of Shore Natural, and he convinced his new wife to go to Thailand and went seed hunting and brought back a couple land-raised strains of seeds. I mean, I don't know. It seems like a pretty impressive thing to get a wife to go to Thailand to go seed hunting.
I'm going to let it progress a little more, but I will tell you one thing. I'm throwing my hat in the ring in Thailand.
That's neat. I hear it's beautiful over there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. I always appreciate it. Actually, for the first time, have a little gift for you. I've never done this before. But we have a couple packages that we put together downstairs.
Thank you.
And this is our Feel Well package. I know you're an active dude, so a little salve, a tincture in there, and some stretch bands and stuff for you to play with.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thank
I really
you for
appreciate
having
it. Give everyone your IG or where they can find you.
My IG.
Or whatever it is, Facebook, wherever they can find you.
At mcardozo1 on Instagram. Or just Mike Cardozo.
Oh, LinkedIn, they can find you on LinkedIn, right?
Facebook.
You do, I mean, throw it out there. I mean, if you do some consulting, you do applications.
Building out a consulting website right now. Do public speaking, application support, you name it.
Yeah,
Import, export,
everything cannabis, right?
A seasoned veteran. Like, I really do appreciate being able to pick your brain when I run into a challenge and just having you on. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.